Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Doston, it's an absolute privilege for me and a pleasure as well to welcome Professor Javed Majeed to the Literary Festival. And finally, after lots of ups and downs, Javed, it's lovely that you're here. For some of you, Professor Majeed, of course, needs no introduction. For others, he's a professor of English and Comparative Literature, Post-Colonial Studies, but has also been described by the late Christopher Bailey as one of the most nuanced historians. So it's a great pleasure for me to ask Javed some questions, but I think the title of the talk is on Iqbal and post-colonial aesthetics, but instead, in fact, Javed is going to focus today on travel and the idea of travel in Iqbal.
Yeah, so just because I think how Iqbal represents travel is an important part of post-colonial aesthetics.
Mike.
Yeah, it's an important part of post-colonial aesthetics and anti-colonialism. So it's just to give the paper a focus. I'll probably speak, and then we can open it up afterwards.
Yeah, to questions. I think that I can't see a clock over here, but would you please, would somebody, would you just tell us when there's 12 minutes left? Just make sure that you can wave out and we'll notice that what is happening. So, Javed, I think it would be interesting if you could sort of say first that, you know, what do you mean by travel in your sort of scholarship, and how one conducts oneself in travel?
Yeah, so I guess when I first read Iqbal and then reread him, what interested me is how often he uses metaphors and images of travel to clarify his sense of self. So he often uses metaphors and images of travel to define khudi. And in a sense, what's key, I think, to his post-colonialism is the representation of travel. In a sense, his poetry is about the art of travel, which is, if you like, how do you conduct yourself when you travel? Are you open to new experiences? Can you redefine your identity through thinking about travel? I think that's the important thing. Can you redefine identity when you think about travel, when you think through the framework of travel? And then also what is the connection between that experience of traveling in imaginary and mental ways and art? What kind of poetry comes out of a preoccupation with travel? Because I think a different kind of poetry, I mean, if you compare Iqbal to Faiz, think about Faiz's prison poems. There, you know, the experience of imprisonment is in producing one kind of poetry, whereas Iqbal's Bange Dara or Javed Nama, which is an experience of traveling, as you know, through the cosmos, is producing another kind of poetry. So, you know, we might also, you know, so I just wanted to make that point. And I guess the important thing about being in colonial India and also post-colonialism is, does travel or thinking about travel, the concept of travel, allow one to experiment with one's identity? So is there a way in which when you travel you can change your identity, you can transform it, you can rethink your identity? In other words, can your identity become a traveling identity? And that's some of the things I wanted to talk about in you know, in Iqbal's poetry. And the other thing is, I've already raised, I mean, I think it's quite interesting that a whole host of colonial figures rethought what travel means. I mean, does travel mean just traveling physically, or can travel also be just a mental act, an imaginary act? Yeah.
I think there's something that you've written about as well, the importance of movement and travel in the Muslim imagination and existence, particularly with Hajj and hijrat.
Yes.
And I think also how it then complicates the idea of geography
Yes.
and of the self.
That's right, yes.
So I think that I might interrupt you
Sure.
sometimes, but I think go for it.
Okay. Well, so I guess, I mean, why is travel, I mean, just generally, why is travel important for colonial intellectuals? Because remember, Iqbal is not alone. Somebody like Gandhi, you know, through his travels to South Africa, actually clarified his political views in South Africa before he returned to India. And so there's a kind of sense in which, and M.N. Roy, the Indian communist, traveled to Germany and Mexico. So there's a sense in which these leading figures used travel to learn not just new things, but to help to define their political commitment. And what is the content of their political commitment. And Iqbal, of course, as you know, spent time in Cambridge and in Germany as a student. But what I'm interested in is more how he uses travel in his poetry. So I mean, in a sense, he uses travel to think about what it means to be modern and what it means to be a Muslim. And what is the relationship between the two. So if, for example, many of his collections of poetry are named after travel. So Bange Dara, which published in 1924, means the caravan's bell. I hardly need to translate for you, but anyway, you know what it means. And it's almost as though, why has he called it Bange Dara? Why has he called it the caravan's bell? Because in a sense, it's almost as though for him, poetry is about starting a journey. It's about motivating a journey. He's likening poetry to ringing a bell at the beginning of the day for when a caravan is about to set out on its day's journey. So it's as though poetry is a motivation to travel. His poetry is like a caravan's bell. It's about opening up the day to travel. And in Shikwa, you'll remember, he actually talks about this when he says that he hopes that hearts may be awakened by the sound of the caravan bell that is his poetry. So he thinks that poetry has an awakening, is like a caravan bell. It actually awakens heart to the possibility of traveling. So I'm going to recite a verse, and excuse my kind of half British accent. What can I say? If I mutilate his poetry, forgive me. So anyway, he says, "Chak is bulbule tanha ki nawa se dil hu, jagne wale isi bange dara se dil hu." So there's a kind of sense in which bange dara is about awakening. It's about having an effect on the heart through the idea of travel. And the image of the poem as a caravan's bell. So his poetry is like a caravan's bell. It's like the ringing of a bell at the start of the day for journeys, repeated in other poems. So for example, Rumi in Asrar-e Khudi, I'm sure all of you have read Asrar-e Khudi. I mean, he actually says, "E darae caravan bidar sho," "O bell of the caravan, awake." So there's this kind of linking of waking up, bells of caravans, and poetry in his work, and that's what I just wanted to call attention to, really. Yeah.
Did you want to actually, because you'd also talked about the art of travel in seeking an interiority, and rather than going outward, the inward journey.
Yes.
So would you like to say something about that, Javed?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So one of the things I kind of was interested in, how are the images of travel in Iqbal different from the images and the representation of travel in Muslims who traveled to Europe in the 19th century. So I read some Safarnamas by Yusuf Khan and Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Karim Khan and Mirza Ittisamuddin. And one of the things that I found quite interesting about the way they express travel, there were two things. One, they were very focused on describing the institutions in Britain primarily, the political institutions, the economic institutions, the church. So they were interested in empirical detail. And the second thing was that as they traveled, it was almost as though they began to feel more and more inferior in comparison to the West, because they represented London as a kind of showcase of modernity. London was for them the pinnacle of technological modernity. And they started to kind of assess themselves in relation to that showcase of modernity. And in a sense, what you get from that travelogue at the end is a sense of inferiority vis-a-vis the West. Indian selves are lacking. When you travel to Britain, or in the case of Ihtisamuddin, Britain and Ireland, you begin to realize what it is that you lack. But what I found interesting in Iqbal is that images of travel are used to empower oneself. So for the 19th century travelers, travel is a kind of experience of disempowerment. But for Iqbal, travel becomes an experience of empowerment. It's about defining the content of oneself. It's about defining khudi. And the other interesting thing I found about travel, if you look at Javed Nama, which is a kind of travel poem, it is a travel poem. I mean, the poem is on this imaginary journey through the cosmos. I wish I could do that, but I can't. And what's kind of interesting about that, I also found, was that the poem is, of course, about politics and economics, but it's also an introspective poem. It's about, if you like, the internal landscape of selfhood. So what the poem is about the external landscape of the external world of politics and economics, religion, but it's also about subjectivity. How does one define oneself? What is one's interior landscape like? Our emotions and thoughts, if you like, are in themselves a kind of world and a kind of landscape. So that's kind of what I was interested in Iqbal. The difference between Iqbal and the 19th century Safarnama that I read by the figures I raised. And it's kind of interesting that in the Javed Nama, Iqbal actually asked this question that, who am I, what am I? In one verse he says, Az makame khud nami dunam kujast, in kadar danam ke az yaran judast. I don't know where my station is. The poem is, he says, I don't know where my station is, makame khud. I only know this, that I'm far away from friends. So it's like the poem is about clarifying his station, maqam. It's about clarifying himself through journey and through his interaction with poets and the writers and poets that he meets on the way. So that's one thing I was interested in. And can I just carry on? I mean, the other thing I found very interesting was that in the Safarnama that I read, there are lots of representation of libraries in Britain and Europe. So there's this preoccupation with how Britain and Europe have built up these very rich libraries, often full of Urdu, Persian, and Arabic works. And it's like for the 19th century travelers, what's interesting about Europe is that it's archiving, that in a sense the loss of power to Europe is reflected in the way these libraries have acquired Urdu, Persian, and Arabic texts. They've acquired this massive archive on India and the Middle East. And there are these quite detailed representations of their experience of the libraries, and again, their sense of loss of power, really, in relation to these libraries. But as many of you will know, what's interesting about Iqbal's Javed Nama is that he actually, poets and authors appear in the poem as characters who he interacts with. So it's not that Iqbal is a passive reader. He's actually an active reader and an active interlocutor with the poets and thinkers that he is imagining his. He has conversations. with these writers and readers. So for him, reading also and interacting with these, the way he imagines these writers is an empowering experience in the Javednama. Whereas in the 19th century Safarnama, reading the Syed Ahmad Khan, Karim Khan, Yusuf Khan, for them reading is a passive and disempowering experience when they're traveling, when they're when they visit these libraries. It's not always the case but that's the link between traveling. So I found that very interesting, that Iqbal is a kind of interrogative reader. He interrogates authors. He doesn't just read them. He questions them. He interacts with them. He imagines conversations with them. He has he imagines conversations with Rumi, Nietzsche is in the poem, Tolstoy is in the poem, and so on. So I guess the point is that for him, reading and these European authors become a part of defining Khudi. And they're not they're internalized, they're not kind of embodied in a European library somewhere, which is a kind of expression of power over the non-West. Yeah.
Javed, the questioning of the self, Man Kiyam, actually takes us quite neatly into Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And if you could say something about how the poetry and that interiority and the exterior journey then leads to the wider landscape of Reconstruction and a very particular kind of modernity. Yeah.
So I guess the thing I found interesting about the Reconstruction, I mean, there are many things one can say about it. It's such a complex work. And as you know, it ends with a quotation from the Javednama. So there's a kind of sense that it brings together poetry and politics at the poetry and his work, Reconstruction, at the end of the book. And I guess I think there are a number of things that one finds. I mean, you've read it, so let me clarify what the main issues are, which are the same issues that he struggles with in his poetry, which is, what is the nature of modernity, and how is Islam going to be reconstructed in relation to modernity? And one of the interesting things I found about the book was that there's almost a sense in which he blurs the boundaries between Islam and Western modernity. It actually becomes quite difficult to know in the end what is Islam and what is Europe. And the reason for that is because he makes a strong historical argument that actually modernity is not something that was just created by the West, but modernity is something that Islam itself made contributions through philosophy, logic, the study of science. And that the problem with the narrative of Western modernity is that it's really about repressing all those other contributions so that it can appear just as Western. So I sympathize with the argument, but the problem is, in a way he says at one point, if I remember him correctly, it's some time since I worked on Iqbal, but if I remember him correctly, that in a sense Europe illustrates all that's best in the intellectual field, all that's best of Islam. So there becomes a kind of sense in which there's a problem here. So I also want to talk about the problematic aspects of Iqbal, which is at the end of the book you lose, it's very difficult to know where Islam ends and Europe begins. And that might be indeed the intention of the book, which is to suggest that modernity is neither Western nor Islamic, but it's a kind of composite modernity. It's a modernity which is both European and Muslim. And in that sense, I think it's quite an important work, because now, currently, at least in history, world history is an important part of this historical studies now. And world history is really, in a sense, about redressing the balance, I think, in some senses. So that's the first thing that's kind of important about Iqbal, because I think in many ways all of us who are in some senses from this part of the world are continually struggling almost on a weekly basis, if not daily basis, with the question of, what is modern, what does it mean to have a modern Muslim self. So that's kind of one of the key important things about the book. And the other thing I found interesting about the book is that Iqbal draws a lot on science, but what kind of science does he draw on? And if you compare him to other intellectuals at the time, Gandhi is a good example. Gandhi's preoccupation was with medicine, whereas Iqbal is not actually, hardly refers to medicine. In fact, I can't remember any reference to medicine. Iqbal's reference is always to theoretical physics, which I think is interesting, and it's something that you all might want to think about, which is why is Iqbal interested in theoretical physics in particular, and not interested in medicine, whereas for so many colonial Indian intellectuals, medicine was, the showcase piece of progress, and it's something that they had to deal with. And one of the things that I guess Iqbal was interested in theoretical physics is that because I think he saw in theoretical physics for him, I'm not saying I agree with him, it becomes very difficult to draw a sharp line between science and religion in theoretical physics. I'm not saying I agree with him, but that's his focus. And the other thing that's interesting about the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam is that very little reference to technology. So, again, if you think about Gandhi is preoccupied with technology, with railways, and so on, whereas Iqbal is less concerned with technological modernity, and is technological modernity empowering or disempowering? What is the role of technology in Islam? What he's concerned with is theoretical physics, Islam, and the nature of reality. So there's a kind of sense in which he's concerned with the fundamental blocks of existence. What does it mean to exist? What is the nature of existence? And I mentioned that because that again is problematic in a way, because he actually says that in one of his speeches to the All Indian Muslim League, that it's quite hard, I think it's in his 1932 speech, it's quite hard when you're a poet and a visionary poet like that to move from visionary poetry to politics. And in a sense, it's something that I think makes him interesting. How do you make that move from poetry to politics? Yeah.
It's interesting because I wanted to actually ask you about, the mobile cosmopolitan Islam that Iqbal actually writes about, both in the Reconstruction and that comes out in his poetry. So this sort of deterritorialized Islam.
Yeah.
And how it resonates with contemporary movements now.
Yep.
And the nation state,
yes.
and that tension,
yes.
and the contradiction there. And you, of course, have written eloquently about both the slipperiness of modernity's moment and the complication, the complicated territory there. So would you like to say something about that?
I think in a sense, let's just, let me go back to, you began with Hijrat and Rumuz-e Bekhudi, and that's another thing we need to think about. We'll come back to what is the relationship between Khudi and Bekhudi, between self and selflessness, and is the self actually tamed by Bekhudi or not, and so on. That's an open question, and I actually don't think it is, but So I guess just to say in so just to say in Rumuz-e Bekhudi, he again makes the link, but basically for him having a Muslim identity means having a traveling identity. And in Rumuz-e Bekhudi he says, Hijrat ayn hayat Muslim ast, in isbab-e sabat Muslim ast. In other words, my hijrah is the law of the life of the Muslims. It's the asbab, the baggage of the stability of the Muslims, which is kind of quite a nice paradoxical way of saying it, which is sabat and hijrat go together. Stability and migration go together. And that's a very paradoxical way of thinking about travel, which is actually travel is, although it's about mobility, it's also about stability. Okay, so travel is stabilizing, which is a very original insight into travel, which is that one might dwell in travel. that you can actually live in travel. You can be at home in travel. And in a sense, I would argue that his entire poetry is about being home in a traveling identity. And you see that in Bangetara, Shikwa, Remuze Be Khudi, Asrare Khudi, that being at home in a sense of being at home while you're traveling is for him, that I would say is his original contribution to a formulation of what it means for him to be Muslim. And it's kind of interesting because, I'm an academic, sorry, I have to put things down, so I have to look through my notes. I'm not one of these people. But it's kind of interesting because you might also want to reread Hali's Musaddas. And Hali has some interesting things to say about travel. Because what he actually says there is, he suggests there's a link between being colonized in India and not traveling. So that traveling actually for Iqbal becomes an anti-colonial act. Because in a sense, the colonial state, if you like, is about rooting Indians in India. It's about incarcerating Indians in India, and traveling becomes a kind of transgressive act. Mobility is a transgressive act. And the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai says something very interesting here. He says that the thing about the word native is that the word native is used to incarcerate people in territories. It's used to root people in territories. It's used to freeze their consciousness. And in a sense, Iqbal's poetry is a kind of, response to that incarceration. But, in the Musaddas, Hali has some interesting verses about travel and, Muslims not disinclined to travel. He says, again, excuse my accent, but he says, "Bahut chal chalao mein ghabra rahe hain, bahut se na chalne se bichta rahe hain, magar ek tumhe ho ke sote ho ghafil, mubada ke ghaflat mein khoti ho manzil." I mean that, in other words, that everybody else is kind of restless to travel, but you yourself are quite happy to stay at home. I mean, that's a terrible translation, but anyway. So I guess, yeah, sorry.
But Javed, of course, with Professor Christopher Shackle, they've done a wonderful translation of the Musaddas. And it's, in my opinion, for what it's worth, I think it's the best translation of the Musaddas. But Javed, I want to sort of take you back to your wider work in the context that Iqbal fits in, because you've interrogated both colonialism and Orientalism. And if I take you into a slightly broader landscape of your own work, to contextualize that, you started with J.S. Mill, of course, and you're now looking at the linguistic survey. So how does, in the wider landscape, Iqbal, how do you situate Iqbal there?
Well, I think the interesting thing about, and this is probably not a fashionable thing to say, I mean, there are two things. One, I think, focusing on individuals. There's also been a move a little bit to focus on individuals in history. Helps us move away from broader narratives to the complexities of how individuals embody and deal with those narratives. So I think there's a kind of return to the kind of category of the individual in history. So I think that's quite important. And the other thing I would say is that, and I actually wrote another article about this, that it's kind of quite interesting that while colonialism might have been economically and politically oppressive, what I find interesting about, because this is pre-1947, about writers and poets is how productive they were in colonial India. It's almost as though colonialism gave them creative opportunities, that they could actually draw upon other traditions, other texts that were circulating in translation, and use them for their own work. And you find this in Bengali writers, you find it in the progressive writers movement, you find it in Iqbal, you find it in Tamil writers, that these writers are cosmopolitan. Because in a sense, what I find strange about colonialism is that, if you like, let me put it bluntly, colonialism was good for artists and poets. however politically and economically oppressive it was, it opened up ways to experiment and to rethink possibilities about literature. You could now draw on European literature, you could draw on translations, you could draw on French literature, you could draw on other literary traditions. So one of the things, I mean, I'm answering your question in a way because it applies to John Stuart Mill as well. One of the things I find interesting about colonialism is that many of the thinkers and writers who deal with it are cosmopolitan in outlook. They draw on a variety of traditions. They're thinking globally. All of them really are thinking globally. Even when they're thinking about the nation, they're thinking about the nation in a global framework. And so that's something we need to think about and this is the same with John Stuart Mill. So for example, John Stuart Mill has to start thinking about, well, if I'm going to think about democracy, I also need to think about, will democracy in India work? Okay, so, you know, these key issues of our political times have to be, what is democracy, what is justice, what does it mean to have an identity, become global issues because of colonialism. You have to think across cultural categories. So that's, kind of my response to you, which is that I think we need to think about the creativity of colonialism and not just its oppressive side, actually. Because it might be politically and economically oppressive in some ways, but in other ways, when you look at the history of Indian literature in the 19th and 20th century, what you're actually faced with is a very rich and fertile landscape of writing, and a very rich landscape of experimentation with writing. And you see it in the progressive writers movement, the way they draw on Marx, the way they Indianize Marx, the way they Indianize socialism, how Fairs, Manto, and many others kind of experiment with ideas to produce unique poetry. So I think that's one thing I would say about in response to that.
Am I right in hearing then that you're saying that oppression, political and economic oppression, is often productive for literature and so on, contentious as that may well be. But I'd like to now draw you back to Iqbal.
Yes.
And go back to Cambridge and Iqbal and philosophy.
Yes.
And if you could say a little bit, because you've again written about it, about the influences there, tying up again with the colonial moment, and how that then informs ideas of history in literature. So what is this relationship between the landscape of history and literature and the intersection?
Between the landscape of history and literature and philosophy, really. Because I guess the other interesting thing about all these writers, I'm sorry, I keep mentioning Gandhi because Gandhi is a very interesting figure to compare Iqbal to, actually. I mean, what I find interesting about all these writers is that they cross the boundaries between literature, politics, and philosophy. So there's another sense in which the colonial situation is not just about opening up literatures, it's also about... So, sorry.
Mine isn't.
See that as a symbol of the downfall of colonialism. But anyway. So we're still working on it, as you can see. But anyway, sorry, I've lost, because of the drama of the downfall, I've lost the question.
I think I've sort of lost my strand as well, but I think I was asking you about what was I asking him? I'm actually so. I was asking you about
Cambridge. That's right.
Cambridge and philosophy and literature, and the intersection of history, philosophy, and literature.
So what I find interesting about Iqbal's time in Cambridge is I did an article on Iqbal and McTaggart. So McTaggart was his philosophy tutor who wrote this massive book called The Nature of Existence, which it was my kind of bad karma to read. Actually, it's a very heavy book. But what I find interesting about that time in Cambridge and about Indian writers and intellectuals at the time is that there's a sense in which you have to go back to the basics. You have to ask questions like, what is the nature of the self? What is the nature of existence? And how might one think about it? So there's a kind of sense in which colonialism makes you think about basic issues in a way in which you might not otherwise think about. In my article, I just kind of looking at the nature of existence and his philosophy tutor and the interaction between Iqbal and his work. What was interesting about McTaggart's work is that McTaggart is a mystic who's also an atheist. I mean, for him, mysticism meant that in the end, I'm not advocating, I'm not endorsing his position, but that in the end, being a mystic meant that you couldn't really hold on to an idea of a separate God. You have to start rethinking about God. And I guess what I'm interested in Iqbal's work is how he uses mysticism, plays with it, inverts it, uses bits of Sufism and rejects other bits of Sufism to rethink the relationship between human beings, politics, and a notion of God, which I think is a very rich and important part of his work. Yeah. So I think.
I think I wanted you to talk a little more about time and space.
Yeah.
And in the sense of his appropriation of this very wide, both historical time and space, and going back and recouping Islamic geographies and philosophies, and how that intersects with history.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It goes back to the reconstruction of religious thought. Why the preoccupation with theoretical physics? Because at the time he was writing, theoretical physics was changing our conception of time and space. And you see it in the Javed Nama as well. There's a kind of exploration of what is the nature of time, what is the nature of space. And I think it's important to remember that thinking about these things becomes difficult, is problematic, because then you begin to wonder about what is the relationship between this rethinking of time and space and the space of the nation state and the space of Islam. I mean, how do you relate the two? The different kinds of spaces and time. And the other reason, I mean, for example, in Javed Nama, he talks about, Rumi mentions that there are many different kinds of time, there are many different kinds of space, there are many different realms of time and space. I mean, you might want to think about, I think it's important to sometimes be basic, and you might want to think about why would time be so important to Indian intellectuals and writers. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is the question of history. What kind of time is history taking place in? And the whole kind of colonial emphasis on the fact that Indians actually don't know how to do history. Okay, so they don't really have a tradition of history, in particular Hindus, but anyway, it's only Europeans who are able to think about history in a new and empirical way. So there's a kind of challenge there, which is how we need to think about history, because people are telling us we don't know how to do history. And also you need to think about other things like the creation of Indian Standard Time by the British. I mean, it was the British who standardized time as Indian. So there's a kind of sense that, time becomes a crucial issue for Indian writers. You see it in Nehru's autobiographies, where he's kind of experimenting with different senses of time. There's public time, there's our subjective experience of time. They're all, they're conflicting. We have conflicting notions of time. And we saw that in the Lahore Festival, first 3 days, then 2 days. So, time keeps changing. So, the reason time is important is because time was brought, the idea of time was brought to a point of crisis by colonialism. And that also gave an opportunity to writers and thinkers to think about the nature of time, and Iqbal thinking about time. And that's interesting because also Iqbal, the important thing about what is the time of modernity, the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam is to say that modernity is not about the 19th and 20th centuries. The time for modernity is much wider than that. It goes back to the so-called Middle Ages. So the modernity itself, it has an unstable, unfixed time. He's trying to unfix it's trying to unfix the time of modernity. It's not just about the 19th and 20th century, but it actually goes back much further than that. So
I think that's actually a great moment to talk about fixed time, because we have fixed time here and we need to end the session. So I would end it by first thanking you, and then opening it to the floor, because I'm sure there are lots of people here who want to ask questions. So thank you, Javed.
Thank you.
And now we go into real time and fixed time. And I open the session to the floor. So is anybody there who would like to ask questions? The gentleman in the front row.
My question to Professor is this, that you mentioned that during colonial times, people were more creative.
Well,
and how oppressive do you think the regimes, present regimes, have to be to bring out the creativity amongst us?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think we need to, that's a very good question. I mean, and it goes to the excellent question, because so many of our panels have been talking about repression and freedom of expression at the festival and so on. I think there are a number of things that one needs to be careful about, which is that we need to think about what does repression mean. I don't think we can think about it just as this monolithic thing, because in some ways there was surveillance on what could and could not be said. Some books were banned and others were not banned by the colonial state. But so I'm going to say something unfashionable here, which is that British colonialism in India worked through existing networks and hierarchies. So there's a sense in which the repression is not just a kind of a repression imposed by outsiders. It's also something that is working through hierarchies of caste, religion, gender, and so forth. So we need to unpack the notion of repression. Similarly, to what extent is colonialism economically repressive? We then have to think about the economics of colonialism. I'm not an economic historian, but the things I've read about it, kind of ask questions like, of course, many groups, powerful groups, particularly landed groups in British India, benefited immensely from colonialism. So we need to have a more fine-grained analysis of what repression means and how it works, and was colonialism more repressive or less repressive than nationalism, than the nation state? Because you could argue that, in my previous panel, I referred to the arrest of the student leader in JNU 5 days ago. You could argue that, in a sense, our experience of the nation state since 1947 is that it has in its own way been equally repressive, if not more repressive. And so I guess for me, what is it that makes the possibility of creativity possible, what makes creativity possible amongst writers and poets, is simply that by its very nature, colonialism knits together places that were not knitted together before, and texts and ideas circulated in ways that they didn't circulate before. And texts and ideas that circulate in translation mean that poets and writers can take advantage of them. And that's what I'm not a, maybe I'm a bit of a politician. I can't give you a yes or no answer, but I just wanted to call attention to the complexity of the colonial situation and also the post-colonial situation.
Well, is there another question?
At the back.
There's one at the back, yes.
Professor, I need to ask a question. As you've told that Iqbal has worked on different various topics like theoretical physics, and he has blurred the boundaries between Islam and the West. And how come, with the passage of time, Iqbal is so much associated with the religious right, with the revival of Islam, and this craving in the mullah and all these people who think Iqbal belongs to them?
Yeah. That's another great question. Thank you very much for that question. And again, I I mean, what's interesting for me when I read Iqbal is to see how, and the same, sorry, I have to mention Gandhi as well, with Gandhi, is just how complex their work is and what's happened to their work when they become icons of nationalism. And there's a sense in which when you look at Iqbal's rich and sometimes contradictory work, that, I mean, there's a difference between, you know, what they're like as poets and writers, and the politics of how they're appropriated. And in a sense, what I find interesting about Iqbal after Iqbal is how he has been tamed, by, sorry, is it working, the mic? Yeah, how he's been tamed, not just by the right, but by basically right-wing nationalists. Just as you might want to, and I think there's a fascinating comparison here with also like how Gandhi's been tamed by India. So I think the problem with the right-wing mullahs is, you know, what can I say? I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, is that they haven't read Iqbal. It's like when I say to my students, you haven't read Gandhi, you haven't read Iqbal. First read him, and then tell me about how right-wing he actually is. But for me, the interesting thing about Iqbal is that he's such a, you know, the term khudi, in Reconstruction of Religious Thought, khudi is such a transgressive idea that I just can't believe that those who have appropriated him have read those passages on khudi. Because khudi is so transgressive, because what he actually says is that khudi is that the closer you approach God, the clearer your individuality becomes. And in many ways, Iqbal is a kind of radical individualist. And that created a problem for him, which is how do you reconcile radical individualism with Islam? And the reason khudi it's such a transgressive idea is because it's not me who's just said that. That's what he says. The closer you approach God, the clearer your individuality becomes. Is that for him, he makes it clear. He actually talks about God as by using the term ego. So he talks about us as egos, and he talks about God as egos, and as an ego. And that's kind of an interesting shift in vocabulary, because it suggests that philosophically the difference between individual selves and God is a difference of degree and not kind. And again, that's not, you know, that's there, you know, that's how he you know, thinks about it. So with that kind of radical idea, I find it very difficult to understand. I mean, I think that it's important for somebody else to write a book on how poets like Iqbal are tamed and appropriated by right-wing nationalism. You know, how their complexities are erased by right-wing nationalism.
We're running out of time. That gentleman put his hand up first, so the gentleman there. Please wait for the mic, sir.
Professor, please tell us why Iqbal talked about nationalism.
Yeah, okay, that's another excellent question. I mean, Iqbal, like many other Indian intellectuals, had very mixed feelings about nationalism. Actually, in one of his letters, he says that what he learned from his time in Europe, which I found really interesting, was how divisive nationalism is. So that's what he learned from Europe. And in the 1930s, he wrote a number of articles where he made clear that nationalism for him, you know, he basically said nationalism is a tool of imperialism, because it is actually, for him, going to divide the Islamic world. Nationalism is a tool, you know, it kind of divides the Islamic world. So, I mean, I think how to reconcile nationalism with kind of transnational Islam is a key issue in his work, and it's something that comes across again and again in his poetry. I mean, you'll see that in his poetry, many of his poems, for example, Masjid-e-Cordoba, are about you know, Muslim events, buildings, culture outside India. So he has a cosmopolitan, expansive view of what Islam is, which can't be fitted into the nation state. You know, the nation state becomes quite problematic for him. And again, he's not the only one. Nehru was deeply ambivalent about nationalism. So I think maybe that's a good place to end, because I think what many of these you know, writers like Iqbal are kind of grappling with is what is the relationship between civilization and the nation state? Because Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism are civilizations which by their very nature can't be contained in the boundaries of nation states. And the same is happening in Europe. What is the relationship between the EU, the nation state, and an idea of European civilization? And sometimes these relationships between civilization and the nation state are very tense relationships. And I would argue that in the end, in the final analysis, Iqbal's poetry is about reconstructing the civilization of Islam, not a nation of Islam. Yeah.
There was a gentleman there who asked a question. Yes.
Professor, a brilliant take on Iqbal. Congratulations for that. I had a few questions, but since the time is very short, I would just confine myself to one thing, an observation and maybe a clarification. I personally feel when you said that there is a bit of contradiction in Iqbal's thought when it comes to radical Islam and the modern Islam, I personally feel that is the biggest issue that confronts us today.
Yeah.
And we have somehow been totally confused by the debate that ensued because of not having read Iqbal.
I'll have to stop you and ask
Madam,
you to ask your question.
I just want to quote one verse which will explain it all.
Okay.
He was the biggest opponent of Malukiyat, Mullayat, and Khankahiyat. Therefore, there's just one verse that I like to quote from Persian. Che Mullai, Che Darweshi, Che Sultani, Che Darbani, Farughe Karmi Joyat, Basalusi Wazarraki.
Yeah, thank you.
If you could explain this to them, probably coming from you, it would be better.
No, I think that's
brilliant.
That's kind of brilliant. And actually, I mean, that's a great verse to end with, because actually it again goes back to Reconstruction of Islam, where it actually talks about the Sharia. And it's kind of interesting. He gives a historical narrative. He says that with the destruction of Baghdad in the 13th century, the Sharia became used by mullahs to hold together, by the ulama to hold together society. And what we actually need, he says some interesting things about the need to reinterpret and recast the Sharia. And what we now need are, to use his very evocative phrase, self-concentrated individuals. He actually says that we need to rescue self-concentrated individuals from what's happened to the Sharia over the last 7 centuries. And I think that was a brilliant insight there, that what happened to the Sharia in the wake of the destruction of Baghdad is something that we are still living with. Yeah. So, and thank you for that verse, by the way, that sums it up brilliantly.
Do we have time for another question?
Okay.
No? Okay, so Javed, thank you very much for reminding us of the instability of every moment and the vagueness of both historic present and past and the future, therefore. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience as well. And thank you for all of you who asked these very insightful questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.